Right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As the topic is really the race is on, are the right technologies in place to decarbonize the maritime industry? First thing is the maritime industry includes ports and terminals, marine services and vessels. Hence, when we consider decarbonizing the maritime industry, we need to account for the carbon footprint based on a life cycle analysis. This is to ensure that in decarbonizing the maritime industry, we do not inadvertently pass the burden of decarbonizing to others in the value supply chain. There are three main categories of solutions that lower GHG emissions, and these are market-based measures, technical and operational interventions, and the use of alternative low or zero carbon fuels. As we grapple to architect the right market-based mechanisms to deliver real reductions in GHG emissions and the modest impact of technology-driven energy efficiency, which actually only ranges from 4 to 9% in general at the moment, we are left with a few large levers that deliver significant impact. These are, for example, slow steaming, engine derating, wind-assisted propulsion, and low-carbon fuels. To accelerate the deployment of these solutions, we must keep the cost of change low by taking advantage of interoperability of current operating assets with minor modifications, availability and accessibility to such solutions, performance reliability with respect to operations, safety, health, and the environment. The key question then these solutions need to address is the degree of impact both in terms of speed to deploy and level of decarbonization. We have today a great lineup of panelists to help us unwrap the considerations in answering some of these questions. I will first invite Jing Xiang to at least describe what does Good Fuels do. She's the general manager there, so the audience can have a feel of the space that you're working in.
Hi. Hi, everyone. So my name is Han Jing Xian, or most people call me JX. I'm the general manager for Good Fuels Asia Pacific Private Limited. So myself, just maybe before I start explaining about what Good Fuels does, so I have been in the oil and gas industry for close to 20 years. And at the urging of actually my teenagers, they actually encouraged me to join more in the clean fuel side of things in bunkering. And that was how I started my role in Good Fuels in Singapore. So Good Fuels Asia Pacific, we actually incorporated the company in Singapore just this year. But Good Fuels, basically, we are a company that's based in Netherlands, in Europe, and we call ourselves a pioneer in biofuels bunkering. I'm very proud that I'm actually invited by Pierre Siwan to be here, because Good Fuels is very much a startup. So we actually started in 2015. And the first 2 years was really tough, trying to convince the ship engine makers, the shipping companies and all that biofuels is not going to mess up their engines and all. So it was not tested and all that. So the first 2 years, a lot of that. But after that we started to use technology, to use data, to use actual pilots to actually convince our customers. And since then, I think in Netherlands, we are definitely the leading biofuels bunkering player there. And basically what we do in terms of biofuels is that we use waste oils. So for example, if you talk about your used cooking oil that KFC actually uses to actually fry their chicken. So we use that, process it, and then put it onto the ship. So in a sense, we skip using fossil fuels, and that helps to actually reduce carbon emissions and all.
Thanks, JX. We're just going to move over to Chung Shun Mao, who's with Equatorial Marine Fuel Management. Shun Mao?
Thank you, Dr. Sanjay. I'm Shin Mao from Equatorial. To introduce Equatorial Marine Fuel, we are one of the largest Singapore marine fuel supplier. In both 2020 and 2021, we were ranked by the MPA as the second largest marine fuel supplier in Singapore. So you will hear us use the term marine fuel and bunkers interchangeably because in the marine industry, they mean the same thing. For us, I think it's significant because Singapore is actually the largest bunker hub in the world. We supply about 50 million tons of bunkers annually, and that's about 20% of what is supplied in the world. And Equatorial does about 10% of what Singapore does. We do about 8,000 operations a year, so you can see that as a company, we do have a lot of experience in this kind of bunker operations. And although we are mainly supplying conventional fuel now, I think as what the topic of this discussion is about, we're also looking at how to decarbonize. So we are looking at a variety of items all the way from energy efficiency to looking at carbon credits, carbon taxation, and also looking at alternate fuels. And I think as what JX has mentioned, one of the leading alternate fuels which is already available is biofuels. So we're also involved in such projects. Yeah, and I'm happy to look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks, Jamal. And finally, we have Wei Xiang from the MPA. He's the Deputy Director at the Sustainability Office. Wei Xiang, maybe just give a sense to the audience what MPA's, what are you working on in terms of MPA's position on this whole greening Singapore?
Sure. Hi, can you hear me? Hi, good afternoon. My name is Wei Xiang. I'm from the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore, MPA. I think MPA as an organization probably does not need introduction here. Well, for me, I think among the panelists, I probably have the least experience in the maritime sector. I mean, I've been with government for some time, but I've been working mainly on energy policies. So yeah, so we're still relatively new to the maritime sector, but quite excited by what the things that we are doing in this space. Just a quick introduction of what I do at the MPA Sustainability Office. So the Sustainability Office has an overview of all the sustainability-related efforts within MPA as well as for Maritime Singapore. I'm not sure if you're aware, but one of our most recent efforts would be the rollout of the Maritime Singapore Decarbonization Blueprint 2050. So I can talk more about it later, but I think it charts our strategies for going forward to decarbonize Maritime Singapore. And I think within it, there lies a lot of exciting information as well as opportunities that we can share with everyone here later.
Thanks, Wei Xiang. So I guess the Maritime's effort to improve energy efficiency has been an ongoing effort through schemes like the EEDI, Energy Efficiency Design Index, SEEMP, which is really around energy management. And now, at least in 2023, they will be rolling out what you call the EEXI and CII targets. So the maritime sector has been constantly reinventing itself through the IMO to improve energy efficiency on the vessels that are underwater, right? And they've also set up a target for 2030, 40% reduction, and 2050, 50% reduction with a baseline of 2008. So, Shamal, from your perspective, what is decarbonization in the maritime industry and how is technology expected to assist?
I think for the maritime industry, especially being waterborne transport, it contributes about 4%. It consumes about 4% of the oil being consumed in the world. So there is quite a large amount of carbon being generated by the maritime industry. In this regard, it's important that people who are involved in the maritime industry look to how to decarbonize, and this can come about through various means. One of it, I think, which Dr. Sanjay just mentioned, is how do we make vessels, ships, more energy efficient? Because that, at the moment, is one of the lower hanging fruits. If we can make ships more efficient, they burn less fossil fuel per mile traveled, and therefore it indirectly contributes towards the reduction of carbon. Other than that, we also look at other issues such as what is the type of fuel that is being burned. And this is very important because what we understand is that in order to achieve our 2030, 2050 goals of decarbonization, the main source, the main item that will help the maritime industry decarbonize will be switching to a cleaner fuel. And of course, that entails other issues. For example, are we looking at a well-to-wake model, or are we looking at a tank-to-wake model, which means that although I can be producing zero carbon while burning a certain fuel, for example, ammonia, but during the production process, a lot of carbon is actually being consumed to generate ammonia, and therefore it may not be seen as an entirely clean fuel. And I think lastly, we'll be talking about carbon taxes or carbon credits, which is also another indirect way. And all these are relevant to technology. Why? Of course, because for carbon taxation, for carbon credits, in order to purposefully utilize such items, there must be relevant technologies in place. For example, carbon accounting. How do we keep track? How do we consume large amounts of data? How do we make sure that all these items are relevant and being accounted for? So there's really a very wide variety in how technology can be applied, both from machinery perspective, fuel perspective, and even, let's say, tracking kind of platforms to keep sure that the maritime industry is able to stay on track to its decarbonization targets.
Thanks for that, Shin Mao. And I just want to swing over to Wei Xiang, and ask you, MPA's role in decarbonization, what is it in respect to technology development and deployment across the various maritime industry stakeholders?
Thanks. Well, from the way I see it, I think from MPA's perspective, I think there are three areas that we look at, right? So first, in setting the broad direction. And I think I mentioned just now, we rolled out the Maritime Singapore Decarbonization Blueprint 2050 earlier this year. And that alone is also sets out the broad direction on where we see, or how we see Maritime Singapore decarbonizing going forward, all the way to 2050. And that roadmap is also not set on its own as a standalone, right? It takes reference from bigger pieces like the IMO initial strategy, what we are doing locally, nationally, in terms of our Singapore Green Plan and things like that. So all these efforts are aligned, but this is the blueprint sets a more specific target and strategies for Maritime Singapore. So I think that's one key pillar of what we are trying to do here. Next, having said that, how do we then proceed? And this is where I think MPA has come in to put in a lot of enablers, schemes and incentives to encourage industry to move in the direction that's been set. So for example, we have the Maritime Singapore Green Initiative, right? And from there, we also have the MINT Fund, which actually funds some of these technological developments in the maritime sector. We also have specific programs like the Green Ship Program, Green Port Program, right? That specifically incentivizes, right? Say ships to use low carbon fuels or to hit a certain energy efficiency levels, right? Yeah. And lastly, I would say, how we're going to do this, we would have to do it in partnership, right? I think MPA alone will not be able to do it alone. We really have to work together closely with the industry, with academia, with the academia and all that. I think one of very recent manifestation of that, I think, is, for example, in the setup of the GCMD, Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization. It was not a MPA alone effort. It was done with industry. It's because we recognize the need to move forward on this, the need to move forward quickly on this. And with six initial industry partners, MPA, we put in funding together and decided to move this forward. So I think these are the three broad areas on how I think the MPA can work together with industry and with everyone to move forward on our decarbonization agenda.
Yeah, thanks for that, Wei Xiang. And if you haven't read the Maritime Blueprint, you should, because it actually really provides a sense of where we want to move towards, and that provides a lot of guide rails. JX, what are the technology-related enablers that needs to be in place to accelerate the use of alternative fuels in maritimes?
I guess before I start, what I would say is that in terms of the use of alternative fuels, it's something that's new, unlike for fossil fuels, which has been used for bunkering for years. So it's not like a plug and play where you put in another company in and they can, everything will flow through because the standards, operations, everything is there. For alternative fuels, because it's new, there are actually a lot of things that for like startups like those in the audience could actually play by using technology to enable, to accelerate the use of alternative fuels. So for example, one like in the biofuel sector, one thing that has been developed quite a lot is in terms of the traceability of the supply chain. So like say, I think for biofuels, we are using a lot of waste oils to actually fuel for bunkering and all. But exactly what is this waste oil from? Is it truly sustainable? Does it actually, compete with food that is actually meant for human use and all? I think that is actually very important, and that's one thing that from a technology perspective, the startups could actually play in that. I guess the other one is in terms of not so much technology, but more maybe even from an engineering perspective, the ability to have actually dual use engines where you could switch from one type of fuel to another. I think that's also important because from a capex perspective, I mean, it's very expensive to build a totally new engine for a new alternative fuels. And looking forward to 2050, we don't see one type of fuel which would be used for bunkering, unlike now where mainly it's still fossil fuels. So you'll be looking at methanol, biofuels, ammonia, and all your biogas and all. So if there's that flexibility, I think that can help to accelerate the use of renewable fuels. I guess the last one, I would say in terms of technology, is the ability to really calculate the greenhouse gas emissions using data. So that's technology because, I could say one thing, another company could say one thing in terms of how their fuels actually reduce carbon emissions. But if you can use technology data to actually show that information, I think that will give people a lot of confidence that the higher cost they're paying for renewable fuels, it's really sustainable, it's really for the good of the environment.
Thanks for JX, and that's a nice segue into the next section is really around multi-fuel scenarios, and this seems to be the current narrative, which is going to define the future landscape in the bunkering industry. And if you're going to meet these decarbonization targets, we really need to kind of address how do we manage a multi-fuel scenario, especially with the challenges from fuel producers, the infrastructure required to deliver these fuels, right? And the demand signals from ship owners that will allow greener fuels to be available at specific routes. So it's a very complex array of, it's just not about the fuel, right? Because the shipping industry is a mobile demand center, and then they actually don't go everywhere, they go to specific places. So how do you manage all these complexity? So JX, maybe I ask you this question. We're seeing an increase in trials of biofuels for the marine sector in the last 1 year. Do you see biofuels playing a significant role in decarbonizing the maritime industry in the next 10 years? What's the trajectory like?
Okay, I would say at least in the next 3 to 5 years, biofuels will definitely play a big role in terms of decarbonization. Because if you look at the type of fuels, it means the cleaner fuels that's available now, biofuels is the one that is a drop-in fuel. You can use the existing infrastructure without putting in too much capex or into it. Operational cost-wise, there's no increase. So we see that. But of course, as I said, I think going into 2030 or 2050, you're going to see a lot of new fuels, cleaner fuels that will come in. But in the short run, so currently, if you talk about biofuels, we're saying it probably take up a very low single digit, maybe 2 to 3% of the bunkering, in the world. So it's a very small percentage. Going forward in the next 10 years, I would say that percentage would be between 5 to 10%. And that will probably stay all the way until 2050. But what will happen is that the fossil fuel proportion will actually go down with the new alternative fuels coming in to replace that. And like I think Dr. Sanjay, as you said, a lot of it is also dependent on regulations in terms of how the other alternative fuels actually comes in. Currently for biofuels, we're talking about reduction of, if we are using the sustainable fuels, waste oils and all that, we're talking about reduction of close to about 80%. Yeah, but if there are new alternative fuels that come in, yeah, that the proportion of biofuels could essentially stay that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks. I guess the important thing is demand signals from the end user. But Shinmao, bunkering is your business, right? And this is obviously one of those scary moments in your life that you think, okay, we got to really pivot, and which direction do we pivot towards? So how are you using technology specifically to help you in your decision making in the decarbonization journey? And I contextualize it in terms of the multi-fuel scenario. How does your organization prepare itself and move forward?
Dr. Sanjay, I think you mentioned because now we are doing almost 100% conventional fuel, so it's really a very big concern. If we want to continue the business 10 years down the road, 30 years down the road, we know that definitely we cannot continue doing what we are doing now. Basically, we'll be, in breach. Basically, we wouldn't even be allowed to continue. But the advantage we have is because having been in the business for over 20 to 30 years as a company, we understand what ship owners want. We understand the evolution of the different fuels. I think we had a taste of what would happen in 2020 when there was a reduction from the worldwide requirement of burning 3.5% sulfur fuel to 0.5%. So back then, I think we had a bit of taste of how the world would react and how the world would change and how it would disrupt the supply chain. For us, technology is at the heart of this transformation. In order to make alternate fuels plausible and other technologies plausible, traceability, as what GX has mentioned, is essential. You realize that even nowadays, if you can supply biofuel, people will not buy it from you. They will not take it from you unless you are ISCC certified. It's palm oils. The European companies, they will not touch palm oil because they are very concerned about slash and burn kind of situations in our neighboring countries. So the only thing that it's able to allay everybody's fears or concern is that there must be some kind of traceability which can only be achieved with technologies in place. So we do see a lot of platforms, digital infrastructures that have adopted blockchain nowadays to make sure that when fuel is taken from one source and transferred to another, there is traceability. And for it to be done at a large scale, it's not enough to do it between one or two different companies, but you need the entire industry to buy into it. One of the projects we have been involved with the whole industry is the SG TradeX, the Singapore Trade Data Exchange, which the official launch was yesterday. And it's, of course, a first step to make sure that data can be transmitted across different parties in a trusted, secured way. And then the similar kind of processes apply to all the different alternate fuels as well, whether it's ammonia, in future hydrogen, if it's going to be methanol and the rest. But of course, maybe we should ask Dr. Sanjay some questions because he's the expert on all these alternate fuels.
That's why I opted for moderator. I guess one of the things everyone is thinking about, okay, we know we're going to have to move to a multi-fuel scenario, right? But how does MPA facilitate that? I mean, you don't own assets. PSA owns the assets. Equatorial owns the asset. Good Fuels owns it. But how is MPA orchestrating so that Maritime Singapore as a whole is ready for that multi-fuel scenario? So how is MPA thinking about that approach?
Yeah, so I think, indeed. Well, that's today's model. How things will evolve going forward, I think it's still very much up in the air. Because when we look at multi-fuel transition, it is indeed quite complex. Because, because it applies different vessels have, when we look at it, could have a different fuel outlook, both in the short term, medium term, and even the long term, right? And what does this translate for Singapore, right? Especially today when we are a bunkering hub. How are we able to maintain our position going forward as a hub, right, in this multi-fuel transition? Will we still emerge as one hub? What do we need to do to prepare ourselves to continue to be a hub? Right, so these are all things that actually MPA are thinking about, and not forgetting that there are challenges that need to be solved. So, for example, if you have a multi-fuel transition and you do indeed end up with multiple different types of fuels to cater to different types of ships, then how are we going to accommodate that in Singapore, right? Given that we are small, land scarce, and all that. Right, because there are fuels going forward that can all have very different characteristics, right? So, what is MPA's strategy then? I think if it goes back to what I mentioned just now, I think a key part of it is partnerships, staying in touch with industry, knowing what's happening. I think in this sense, MPA has been involved in a couple of industry consortiums, right? Like Castor Initiative, Itoshu Consortium, things like that, to keep in touch with what exactly the industry is thinking, not only locally, but internationally. What are the key trends and things like that? Recently, I also went on a study trip to the World Hydrogen Summit in Rotterdam, where we also get to know what's the latest and greatest in maritime technologies for the decarbonization, right? Hear from industry exactly what is needed and all that. And in terms of partnerships, I think earlier this morning, actually, I just had a meeting with Dr. Sanjay talking about the ammonia safety study that that GCMD is doing. So a lot of it also involves MPA being very hands-on, staying in touch with what's closely happening on the ground and things like that. But this is the industry-facing part of MPA. I think another aspect of it is, MPA is also part of the larger government, right? Part of government in Singapore. And I think this is where we also try to find synergies, right, with the other sectors in Singapore. And this is not a new thing today as well, right? So, for example, a lot of conventional marine fuel oil today, I think we are also, there are a lot of synergies with the energy and chem sector on Jurong Island today, right? So, with the new fuels or new alternative fuels going forward in this multi-fuel transition, will we continue to have that, right? Such that as a whole, Singapore can progress together. So these are some of the areas that we're all looking at from MPA's perspective as part of this multi-fuel transition.
Thanks for that, Wei Xiang. And JX, I just want to swing back over to you, right? Because when we look at the alternative fuels like green ammonia, e-methanol, bio-LNG, they're quite some ways away, right? Although there's a lot of announcements on investments and production of green hydrogen to make these fuels. So biofuels is really going to be one of the earlier candidates to move forward with. But from your perspective in good fuels, how do you sustain that business as the other new fuels begin to ramp up? So what is really from a GHG emission perspective, right? How much of a headroom does biofuels have in terms of its accounting compared to the other fuels that keeps it really way ahead because of its biogenic nature?
So for biofuels, so this is a bit of advertisement for good fuels. So for good fuels, we don't use any palm-related products. Yeah. So for us, we focus more on the waste oils and all. And with that, and especially if it's RED certified and all that, we are talking about more than 80% greenhouse gas, basically reduction in terms of greenhouse gas and all. And of course, with that's because we use B100, which is basically 100% biofuels. In Singapore, because like if you look at a lot of the pilots that's happening, because of the high cost of biofuels, I think we do more lower blends. So with that, of course, then the GHG reduction actually reduces. But from a good fuels perspective, I think how do we continue to sustain and compete with the other alternative fuels that's coming up? What I'll say is that I think we have two teams, which for me is very important. One is our sourcing team. So the team that actually goes out there to source for all these waste oils and all, I think they're continuing going out to talk to the market to understand what are some of the waste streams that we could take in to reduce the cost of biofuels to our customer. I think that's very important. The other thing that in terms of team that we have is the innovation team. So they also are continuing going out there to actually look for new fuels to do pilots, trials and all that for other alternative fuels that we could use. So I guess, I mean, we are very small. So like I said, I think we are a startup, we are a very small player. But even though we are small, we continue to innovate, to find new ways of reducing costs to our customer, but at the same time, fulfill our mission, to make this a better world for everyone.
Thanks, Jackson. It's again a nice segue to the next section. Is really about impacting today and being future ready. As we look ahead to set the maritime sector up for success and find the least cumbersome pathway towards IMO targets, or even at least zero or even negative carbon shipping at best by 2050, we will need all hands on deck. All hands meaning producers, supply chain, governments, customers, and consumers. We need to consider how we bend the decarbonization curve today and be future ready to bend it further. So Wei Xiang, what else do you think we can do as needed to accelerate the maritime decarbonization impact today and be future ready tomorrow? And it's, I guess, in a way to ask, the question is not so much as what MPA can do, but how does MPA encourage industry? Because that's where the scale is, right? So what else can we do that you want industry to do to get us across the line?
Well, I think this is an interesting question, right? Because for maritime decarbonization, on one hand, I think we all recognize the urgency of it, right? As as part of climate change and all that. But yet, on the other hand, there are still so many critical uncertainties, right, in going forward. I think when we talk about, say, we discussed extensively about the multi-fuel transition just now. I think this is just a manifestation of one of those critical uncertainty. But because of that, it is a little bit difficult to move forward when actually people are not sure, when the demand's waiting for the supply is waiting for the demand, and things like that. I think this is where, I'd say MPA has a role to play to facilitate that, the discovery, to move forward. I think maybe on a little bit of a leap of faith, but I think this is where we would need industry support. There are a few more things that we are thinking of doing moving forward. If you look at what we have done more recently, for example, we have signed on the Clydebank Declaration, right? It's on building green corridors, right? So you can roughly see where the efforts that we are heading, right? Leveraging on our status as a hub today and try to push the boundaries a bit further, working with other people. But I think this is where we think we need the industry to come on board with us. And when we push out new initiatives, programs, and things like that, we do encourage the industry to work with us. If you're unsure of anything, come to us, right? Because we are quite sure there are many exciting opportunities in this space. And together, I think even, from a small country like Singapore, Maritime Singapore will be able to punch above its weight in decarbonizing the whole maritime sector. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And I guess I'm now going to look to Shun Mao because you're actually in industry, right? And beyond technologies that directly decarbonize the sector, what do you think are there other enabling solutions or services that should be in place to both impact the short term and being future ready that is missing today in the ecosystem?
I think what we see today to impact the decarbonization of the maritime industry indirectly would be the utilization of carbon credits. I think a lot of us still do not really understand how it can be exploited and how it can lead to a lot of benefits to the entire industry. For example, one example of carbon credits is that if you buy carbon credits, the cost or the monies that go into buying these carbon credits go into decarbonization projects. So perhaps, there could be a maritime decarbonization fund which is funded by carbon credits that can be quite interesting. So it goes into research and development specific to the maritime industry. We have spoken to different parties. For example, we have spoken to Climate Impact X, which is one of the Singapore exchanges for carbon credits. I think they are focused more on forestry, but so far we have not come across any which is focused on decarbonization in the maritime sector. We believe that this was raised at the IMO level maybe 1 or 2 years ago, that there should be a carbon tax on ship owners such that when they buy bunker fuel, a certain amount of the tax cost will go into research and development. So I think these are things that can be interesting, because a lot of the focus or a lot of these products such as carbon credits were created for the wider industry, but they also can be utilized for the maritime industry. So there are some of our thoughts about it.
Thanks for that. And JX, what are some of the wild cards that the industry might want to keep an eye on, which will hamper or propel the deployment of renewable fuels in the maritime industry?
Okay. So talking about propelling, I think like what Shemal talked about, having carbon tax, on the fossil fuel. I think that's one. Of course, subsidies from the government is also another one, and that's why in Netherlands, actually, why the take-up of biofuels increased significantly was actually after the implementation of the Dutch incentive scheme. So that will definitely propel. But unfortunately, because now all these mandates are voluntary, I mean, it's not something that is mandatory by IMO, and also it's really subject to every country in terms of what they would actually want to support. I guess the other one for us in terms of propelling, where we see is that, of course, the shareholders of these companies that actually sell fossil fuels and all, I think they are also pressuring the major oil companies to say, okay, we need you to be sustainable, to be clean, and reduce the greenhouse emissions. And that has definitely helped to actually propel the use of renewable fuels. The other thing that we are seeing from good fuels is that actually the cargo owners. So for example, the likes of IKEA and all, where you buy your furniture on, they are not the ones who are actually paying for that fuel. I mean, they are paying indirectly, but they are the ones who are actually pressuring the shipping companies to say that, okay, for me to use your ships, I need them to be on sustainable fuels and all. So they are the ones who are actually indirectly influencing, the use of renewable fuels, which is in line with, their corporate strategy to be sustainable and all. So I think that's more from propelling. I think in terms of hampering, I would say one thing, as I said, I think biofuels, the cost is actually a lot higher than fossil fuels. So with low oil price, actually, it will definitely slow down the take-up, of biofuels, mainly from a cost perspective. That's one. I guess the other one, which we did discuss, is really a lot of the ethical issues in place. So you're telling people that, okay, you have to pay higher prices for your renewable fuels, but at the same time, if there are any ethical issues that comes up, I think that will significantly affect, why people are willing to actually pay higher prices for cleaner fuels.
Thanks for that. I got a last question for all of you, and I want to contextualize the last question, right? We're doing this not because we want to play around with new technologies. We do this, we are going through this heartache of thinking, discussing, innovating, because we believe there's an existential threat on climate change. We know the biggest resource we don't have in fighting climate change is time. So at one point, we are asking government, industry, and everything to, get on with it and find the solutions, innovators. But there's a big muscle that has yet to be pulled and flexed, and that's the green consumer. And, how do we get green customers, green consumers agreeing to sharing the burden of higher premium for green fuels, higher service costs for those kind of maritime services, right? Higher infrastructure development from the government. Everyone needs to share, but maybe give me your thoughts on how do we mobilize that big muscle, which is the green consumer, to say, yes, we have a common problem. How can we share that burden, and what kind of mechanism that we can create that is sustainable to share the burden? Any thoughts around, maybe they're not even willing to pay, what are your thoughts around that? So maybe I'll start with JX and I'll move down towards Wee Siang.
Yeah, so this is a question we have a lot with our customers. I mean, who are the ones who are actually buying fuels, right? In terms of that big price difference between your fossil fuel and biofuels. And I think, Dr. Sanjay, you're right. I think it's, the way we see it is really, so for example, if I take in Netherlands, where so far I would say they have been very successful in terms of rolling out the use of biofuels, is that this difference in price needs to be so-called shared really by three parties. So one, of course, I think in Netherlands, the Dutch government actually gives certain incentives. I think that helps. The other one is really in terms of cargo owners, for them to say that, you know, they are willing to pay more, but then that more is then split up into from a TU perspective in terms of tonnage. And if you add that up, I mean, it's not a lot more, but it's also the transparency to the customer to say that, okay, whatever the extra that you're paying for, it's really contributing to, you know, reducing carbon emissions in the world and all that. I think that's something that is very important, which I think from a technology perspective, data-driven perspective, I think that's going to be very critical, so that people will feel that, okay, really I'm paying for something, because it's not just say, they can really see the data behind it and feel that they are making an impact.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Shin Mao, thoughts?
For us, we are mainly doing in the B2D field, business to business. So what is one of the most important things, that there is an even playing field, whether it's from a seller or a buyer. And you know, it's always difficult when you want to do something which is maybe environmentally more friendly, but it puts you at a competitive disadvantage to other players in the market. But what we also see is that the world is changing. I think people are becoming more mature. If you look at the B2C arena, you know, people are becoming more receptive towards climate change. You know, in fact, a lot of people feel strongly about it. My wife told me that we get a new car, it has to be an electric car. And even for us, you know, when we look at what it's going to be like moving forward, we feel that this will translate to the B2B field, because now I think when we look, being in the oil industry as well, we do talk to some of the MNCs, the conglomerates, you know, and even them buying oil from a certain country, you can see that there are people on the ground are facing pressures as well. And whether this will happen in the future, you know, if we are supplying fuels that are harming the environment, will we see that such companies face pressure not just from other companies but from the public as well? Perhaps that could be a game changer as well.
Thanks. And Wei Xiang?
Yeah. So, well, a long time ago, I used to work in the Ministry of Education, right? And there was a saying that, you know, education is always the answer. It's always part of the answer to everything. So I think, well, I think there's a certain element of truth in that. I think that people do need to know that they are able to make a difference, right? I think that's what, just echo a little bit what JX has said just now. And I think it's also important for them to know that whatever they do is indeed making a difference, right? So, because climate change is a long-term endeavor, right? So we just have to keep going at it. And people have to remember that back of their minds that this is something that we have to keep doing, right? Because there's always a danger that we get distracted by the latest crisis, right? Yeah. And of course, and another point I would add, there's actually behind every crisis, there's also always an opportunity to push this agenda, right? What I've heard like is, it's like, wow, with inflation and all this, actually, would this make people, well, less willing to pay that green premium, and because of that, be less willing to do their part for climate change and sustainability, for example. But I would say that actually there are also opportunities behind that. So, for example, you know, when oil prices rises, it actually makes the difference between the price difference between green technologies and conventional technologies smaller. So therein lies an opportunity as well for us to nudge people to switch. right? So I think if we can approach things from some of these different mentalities, see it from different perspective, I think we can continue to convince people that we have this is an effort that we have to continue to plug at in the long term.
Thanks for that. I just realized we got 13 seconds left. I'm just looking to the organizers. Can I steal 5 minutes more just to see whether there are questions from the audience? But I'll go no more than 5 minutes. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. Any questions from the audience? Sure. None for me, this one.
Sure. Good evening, all. A quick note on what Mr. Sanjay said about how the clock is running in terms of sustainability efforts till 2050. Can you share thoughts on what is your perspective on investing in new companies which are more sustainability focused? Or are you going to capitalize on putting more money for yourself into increasing your sustainability efforts? Or do you think in terms of carbon tax impact, you're not really that impacted?
All right, so I'm just going to try and paraphrase the question so that I make sure I got it. So what you're asking for is perspective on what are the investment decisions, or are you going to allow carbon incentives to drive innovation?
In general, carbon tax impact is going to affect everyone in future.
Right.
And Singapore government has recently launched through their budget carbon tax impact of incremental values through 2030. So do you think to save yourself economically, PR-wise, you're going to increase your capital investment? Or do you think you are going to acquire new companies who are working on sustainability?
Okay. So I guess MPA is not going to acquire any company. I'm not going to acquire any company. So I'm going to leave it to Goodwheels and Equatorial to answer that question.
I think maybe I can put some words on this. I think we believe, Equatorial believes that decarbonization, I think ultimately issue will have to be resolved and have to be solved by new companies, new startups. That's where all the new innovation, the new ideas come from. Of course, as a traditional or long-term business, we have the experience in how the industry operates, what the customer wants, and how to make sure that things are practical, because we have seen startups with very good ideas, but they don't understand the complexities of the business. So, but at the same time, what they lack in experience, they really have in terms of innovation, ideas, and these are actually very important. But what we hope not to see is that you have a good idea, but you end up on the wrong track and your idea is not able to take off because you have overestimated, underestimated, misunderstood how the industry is.
Yeah, so what I would say is that, in terms of investing in companies, related to sustainability and all, the way we see it is we're not going to totally just look at your carbon tax as your main revenue driver. I think the main thing is really focusing on that whole value chain and trying to reduce that cost through economies of scale, through technology and all. Because we have to remember in terms of the carbon tax or subsidies and all, things would change. So in Netherlands, when it first started, I think it was because the government was trying to actually encourage companies to actually take on biofuels. It was bigger, and then slowly it moved on. So if we had used our business model at that time to base on that higher incentives, then slowly you actually start to realize you lose your competitiveness. So it still has to be really driven by the real business in terms of really trying to reduce the cost of that supply chain and all to make your investment decisions.
I guess in short, it's return on investment, now also got return on the environment. So any other questions? We've got 1 minute. 1 minute left, yeah, a quick one, then we'll wrap up.
Yep, so with the targets for 2030 and 2050 coming up, how hard do you think IMO and other regulatory authorities will push shipping companies to start adopting these measures, or do you think it's going to be a more voluntary approach?
I think IMO is serious. It's been ratified. So everyone's on board. The question really is, what is the right pathway to achieve this? CII is coming up next year. EEXI is coming up next year. So there's going to be a lot more instruments to drive the shipping industry to really try to meet those targets. But it is not an easy target to meet. And I think you will notice in the news that some shipping companies have actually now going for zero shipping. So they're going to overperform against the target. So there's a lot of leadership willingness to try to do the right thing in trying to achieve those targets. That's my sense, and I don't know whether that's consensus there. Maybe MPA, you can give a sense with being part of IMO and all.
Yeah, I do agree that actually the IMO is moving and in a very concrete way, and I think Singapore as part of as a responsible flag state member, I think we are also moving together with IMO, and I think in specific areas we are also, in fact, we're trying to see is there other areas where we can build on what IMO is doing and go even further, right? So for example, in some of our incentives programs and things like that, we already started to encourage people to go for zero carbon fuels and things like that, right? So it is I would say the IMO forms like a baseline that we all work with, and I think we are all trying to see whether or not we are able to do more.
Okay, great. I've never seen the clock go from white color to red color, and it's counting up now. So which means it's not a countdown. That means I'm over exceeded by 53, 54, 55 seconds. Now, a round of applause for the panelists for a great conversation, and look forward to seeing you all somewhere in Singapore at some time in our lives. Thank you so much, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.